Hello everyone, and welcome to Stories to Watch 2025. My name is Dasgupta, President and CEO of World Resources Institute. WRI is a global research organization working to improve people's lives, protect nature, and halt climate change. Stories to Watch is something we do in the beginning of every year, sharing what we think will be the biggest ideas and events that will shape our world over the next 12 months. This year is the 10th anniversary of the historic Paris Agreement. In 2015, world leaders came together to avert the worst climate impacts, agreeing to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Many saw this as a beacon of hope for the planet. 10 years later, we have mostly failed to implement that ambition. The 2024 Emission Gap Report finds we must reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 57% by 2035. This means cutting emission by 7.5% every year over the next decade. However, our carbon emissions, the main cause of climate change, continue to rise. The impacts are clear. 2024 was the world's warmest year on record, yet again. One of our stories from last year focused on the dangers of heat in cities, which kills thousands. Already in 2025, California experienced the costliest wildfires in US history, and Southern Africa continues to face one of the worst droughts in decades. Despite this, we believe today the Paris Agreement is even more critical than it was 10 years ago. The US leaving Paris will not stop climate impacts from hurting Americans, nor will it slow the economic transition already underway. But it will keep the US out of the only venue to influence climate decisions. Last year's Stories to Watch focused on election and why they matter. Politics reshapes international relations and outcomes. You can see our take on what actually happened in 2024 on WRI's social channels. Geopolitics greatly impacts how finance flows between countries. One of the biggest barriers to increasing climate ambition and delivering results on the ground is finance. International finance not flowing to the countries and communities that need it most. Last November in Baku, finance was the main topic of discussion at the COP29 climate negotiations. Delegates from across the world wrestled with questions of financing global climate action. How much money is needed? Who should pay? For the first time in 15 years, leaders came together to agree on a new climate finance goal to deliver at least $300 billion annually by 2035 to developing countries. The existing goal was $100 billion per year by 2020. In addition, they agreed that all actors should work together to mobilize $1.3 trillion per year for developing countries by 2035. There was mixed reaction to this negotiated outcome. Some countries thought it was ambitious, but most developing countries were disappointed. They thought donor countries did not do enough, and they were not clear how they would get the $1.3 trillion they actually need. Mobilizing this money and making it flow to developing countries is critical for the global transition. But first, where does this $1.3 trillion number come from? The UN asked a group of experts what the global financial need will be for the economic transition in the next 10 years. They projected that the entire world will require about $7.5 trillion per year by 2035. As you can imagine, this is an estimate. Many things can happen in the next decade. Out of the $7.5 trillion, $4.3 trillion of these climate finance needs will be in China and developed nations like US and EU. These countries are able to finance their own transitions. The remaining $3.2 trillion is needed in developing countries who have far fewer resources. The same report estimates that $1.9 trillion of the $3.2 trillion can come from public and private domestic resources in developing countries. This means developing countries need an additional $1.3 trillion from external funds to meet their transition goals. That's where the $1.3 trillion number comes from. Let's think for a minute what will happen if this money does not flow to developing countries. First, the most vulnerable people who have contributed least to climate change will continue to suffer the most. This unjust suffering will exponentially increase in the coming years. This is why finance is fundamentally about justice. Second, these countries will not decarbonize their economies at the speed and scale needed. As a result, the whole world will not decarbonize. So the finance from richer countries to developing countries is not just charity. It's an investment towards a safer world. This year is an incredibly important year for ambition. By COP30 in Brazil, all countries are supposed to come back with higher climate ambitions for 2035. Without certainty that adequate finance will be available, many developing countries will be reluctant to put forward ambitious plans. But if we find ways to ensure climate finance can flow, more countries can join the race to the top. Increasing finance and growing ambition is a virtuous cycle. We need to unlock both. That's why this year's Stories to Watch is about how to meet the $1.3 trillion per year goal. Before we get into numbers of billions and trillions, our first story is about what is the money for. First, we need to address the climate impacts that are already here and rapidly escalating, taking lives and impacting livelihoods. By 2030, vulnerable countries could face more than $500 billion in climate-related damages each year. Second, we also need to make sure the climate crisis doesn't get worse. Developing countries need to decarbonize their economies and find a path to low-carbon growth. And we should not forget the protection and enhancement of nature is a critical component of both building resilience and reducing emissions. We are experiencing increasing levels of climate devastation, from floods and droughts to wildfires and storms. Last year, terrible floods in Spain, Bangladesh, and Brazil displaced thousands and killed hundreds. Meanwhile, devastating droughts in Africa, Europe, and South America destroyed agriculture and pushed up global food prices. But even if climate impacts are happening everywhere, suffering is not evenly distributed. Low-income countries lack the resources to adequately deal with, let alone prepare for, climate disasters. And even for nations that may be reasonably well off, impacts can destroy a huge proportion of the economy. To get a better idea of the challenges they face, let's go to St. Vincent and the Grenadines, where we have Courtney Bailey joining us.
Last year, Hurricane Beryl, the earliest Category 5 Atlantic hurricane on record, hit my country, devastating several southern Grenadine islands. In Union Island, 98% of homes and dwellings were destroyed, and the ground was stripped of trees. As I stand here speaking to you 6 months later, majority of the island is still without power. Hurricane Beryl almost completely destroyed several cash crops, such as bananas, avocados, and coconuts, leading to food shortages and loss of income for many farmers. Finance to prepare for and build resilience of homes, critical infrastructure, local communities, and sensitive economic sectors to these extreme weather and slow onset events is critical, not just for sustainable development, but for survival in places like St. Vincent and the Grenadines. To recover, we utilize post-disaster loans, which means that more of our income goes to servicing debt. The weaker our economic situation, the harder it is to proactively invest in adaptation. That is why influential leaders such as Honorable Mia Mottley, Prime Minister of Barbados, is calling not just for aid after hurricanes, but relief in servicing our debt and longer-term, lower-cost support to our government budgets to build resilience. Adaptation finance is a necessity for small island developing states. With it, we can protect our island, our environment, our livelihoods and economies from the impacts of climate change. The adaptation needs of these islands, like my home country, shows us why we need climate finance. And that's our story to watch for 2025.
That was Courtney Bailey, one of WRI's experts on adaptation finance. Most vulnerable countries need additional climate finance to build resilience and minimize future impacts. However, research shows that less than a fifth of adaptation finance even reaches local communities that need it most, even though these communities are best placed to decide how these funds should be used. Finance needs to flow to the right places sooner rather than later. In some places, climate impacts are so devastating that it is not possible to adapt anymore. When this happens, countries need financial support to get back on their feet. This is a separate piece of the puzzle called loss and damage funding. Of course, recovery is always better and less expensive when countries have prepared for a disaster. Finance for adaptation saves lives and livelihoods and makes economic sense. Look at Bangladesh. In 1970, Cyclone Bhola killed at least 300,000 people, even though it was only a Category 3 storm. The country responded by investing in resilience, from storm shelters to early warning systems. When Category 5 Cyclone Mocha hit in 2023, only 3 people were killed in Bangladesh. However, the world is a long way behind where it needs to be on adaptation finance. The target set during COP26 in Glasgow was $40 billion per year by 2025. We are actually on track to meet this target, but $40 billion is nowhere near enough. As you can see in the chart behind me, the estimated adaptation finance gap is up to $360 billion per year. We have established that countries need finance to build resilience to an already warming world. At the same time, the world needs to curb greenhouse gas emission at speed and scale to keep the problem from getting worse. Decarbonizing our energy system is important for stabilizing our climate. It also has many other benefits, like cleaning the air we breathe and improving energy security. But energy investment requires very different kinds of finance than adaptation investments. Today, emissions remain stubbornly high, and if trends continue, they will keep growing. Countries need to take steps across sectors, like energy, to bend the curve. Let's think for a minute where these emissions come from. As you can see, low and middle-income countries make up to 70% of the emission. In particular, large developing countries contribute almost half of global emission. We don't just need places like US and EU to decarbonize. We need China, as well as countries like India, South Africa, Brazil to do the same. Thanks to falling cost and government investment, wind and solar power are being rapidly deployed around the world. But this is not happening at the same rate everywhere. Countries in Africa only attract around 3% of global energy investment, despite being home of 1/5 of global population and 60% of the world's best solar resources. South Africa stands out. The country has made clear commitments to decarbonize the energy system and has secured international climate finance to support it. Here's WRI's Katie Ross from the town of Komati to tell us more.
The enormous concrete cooling towers behind me are what remains of the Komati coal-fired power station. This was a coal-fired power station built in the 1960s, and for decades it's been a cornerstone of South Africa's energy system, taking in vast quantities of coal and producing electricity. Komati now faces a daunting challenge of phasing out of coal. South Africa has one of the world's largest coal reserves and is one of the world's largest coal producers. And like many countries around the world, is facing increasing pressure to decarbonize the energy system to tackle climate change. Millions of dollars in international support have been pledged to help Komati make that transition from coal to renewable energy, while supporting the workers and the communities around the power station. This is an excellent project, it's well conceived, but there have been tremendous challenges in its implementation. Firstly, there's been a significant gap between when the coal plant closed in late 2022 and when the renewable projects are expected to come online sometime in 2025. While many of the workers at Kamati have found new opportunities at other power stations, the communities here in Kamati have been left in the lurch. Many of the community members have not experienced the benefit of retraining programs or reskilling programs, and the economic diversification projects that have been promised are still in the pilot phases. There are so many lessons here at Kamati. The first is around timing. You've got to be planning for new projects and new economic diversification opportunities as soon as the plant is planning to shut down. And the second is sequencing. These new projects need to be online well before the coal plant is shut down. And finally, it's about finance. The finance needs to be delivered swiftly, transparently, and impactfully to support better outcomes for people and the planet. Kamati shows us the importance of climate finance, and this is our story to watch for 2025.
That was Katie Ross, Senior Director of Climate Action at WRI. Large developing countries like South Africa face huge pressures. They must reduce emissions while creating jobs and opportunities for their sizable population. The challenge is particularly acute in South Africa, where the unemployment rate for the last several years has remained stubbornly high, over 30%. South Africa is committed to net zero pathway, but they won't be able to transition at the pace necessary without external finance. In the long term, most of the money for investing in clean energy can come from private sector, as there are clear returns for these investments. But initially, public investment is necessary to create self-sustaining market. Some parts of the energy transition, like decommissioning coal-fired power plants or supporting retraining workers like in Kamati, will still require much more concessional financing. South Africa is not the only place that needs finance for energy transition. The International Energy Agency estimates annual clean energy investments in developing countries needs to increase more than 7 times by 2030. These countries require transition financing not only to decarbonize the energy system, but also to invest in the broader decarbonization of the entire economy, including transportation, buildings, agriculture, and industry. And if we consider the need for climate adaptation, developing countries will need many different kinds of climate finance to support these diverse investments. So what should we watch for this year? First, the adaptation finance gap is increasing. At COP30 in Belem, will negotiators commit to at least double adaptation finance from $40 billion to $80 billion per year. Second, in 2023, countries made a historic agreement to establish a loss and damage fund. Last year, countries made a critical step in deciding that the fund would be hosted by the World Bank. This year, will the fund be ready to start disbursing financial support to countries? Third, countries will be updating their NDCs or climate plans this year. The deadline to submit is in February, but we expect many countries to release their plans as late as this fall, ahead of COP30 in November. Will we see meaningful ambition on both mitigation and adaptation, along with investment plans? From adaptation and loss and damage to mitigation, the various financing needs in developing countries will remain a critical area of focus in 2025 and beyond. Our second story is about where the money will come from. 1.3 trillion may seem like a very large amount of money, but let's put it in perspective. Our estimates show that the global GDP will be around $150 trillion in 2035. So 1.3 trillion will be less than 1% of global GDP. A more relevant comparison is how much we invest in infrastructure. The world invests approximately 10 to 15% of GDP on infrastructure every year. $1.3 trillion will be 1/10 of that in 2035. Now, let's go to Nairobi, where Melanie Robinson, WRI's Global Director of our Climate, Economics and Finance program, is joining us to help us understand how we can get to the $1.3 trillion. So Melanie, let's start from basics. What was in the $300 billion goal that countries agreed to in Baku last November?
Well, to understand the 300 billion, we need to go back to the previous goal of 100 billion, and 116 billion was finally delivered in 2022. That was made up of three parts. First, there was the bilateral part, so rich country governments giving to poorer countries, the multilateral part, multilateral development banks, multilateral climate funds, and thirdly, leveraged private finance. Now, the 300 billion has got the same three parts, but expanded, especially the MDB bit, and it does count money going from a broader set of countries.
Melanie, thanks. We just heard from Courtney and Katie that there are diverse needs for different kinds of investments. Will this $300 billion goal be able to meet that demand?
Well, we don't know exactly what mix of grants and loans and private finance is in that 300 billion goal, but there will certainly be a good amount which is in long-term loans and private finance, which is so important for funding investments that have a return, like renewables, especially in those richer developing countries. But it is so important that in this 300 billion, we have enough of that precious grant and highly concessional, cheap loan finance, because that's really important for adaptation, loss and damage, just transition funding, to the poorest and most vulnerable countries in particular. And that's why it's so important that actually just before the agreement to 300 billion, we found out that the fund that the World Bank has for the poorest and most vulnerable countries was replenished so that they have got 100 billion to spend over the next 3 years.
And do you think the debt burden, which is already a significant problem for over 50 countries, will become an even bigger issue?
Yeah, MDBs are a really amazing leveraging machine. For every $1 of taxpayers' money that goes in there, they can turn that into $4, even up to $10 in money provided to developing countries. And what they've managed to do over the last few years through some reforms is stretch that money even further. So a lot of the MDB growth has come from those reforms, from that stretching of the money that they already have. Now, debt is an issue, and increasing number of developing countries are in debt distress, and that makes it particularly important that there's enough concessional finance, that loans are long-term and affordable, and ultimately that we find a more effective way to restructure and even relieve debt.
I think restructuring debt needs to again take center stage, but it hasn't been a big part of the conversation for a while. Let's assume for a minute that we will be able to get to $300 billion. That still doesn't even get us near what we need. Experts think that half of the $1.3 trillion needs to be public finance. What are the other ways we can increase public capital?
So there are three big ways that we can do it. The first is capital increases, the multilateral development banks, putting more money into the banks so they can really leverage that and provide more to developing countries. Second is innovative taxes. We can tax some of the polluting areas that are under tax at the moment, like aviation, maritime, oil, and that could raise over 200 billion. And thirdly, we will need to look for other innovative sources because even that won't be enough.
Thank you, Melanie, for laying out how we can start building towards a $1.3 trillion goal. Let's look at what to watch for in 2025. First, will member countries consider more fundings to MDBs so they can increase their capacity to finance? Current political headwinds may make it difficult. But let's remember that the last capital increase was in 2018, when some of those same headwinds were also at play. Second, will international taxes gain traction as new sources of climate finance? For example, will the International Maritime Organization make progress on establishing levies on shipping? Countries including Kenya, Barbados, France, and Brazil have put together a task force to look at new ways to raise additional finance through international taxes or levies. Will there be broad acceptance of their proposal when they release it at COP30 in Belem? Third, the Finance for Development Conference will take place in Seville in June. This is a gathering of world leaders that takes place every 4 years to discuss the future of development finance. Will they make strides in reforming the global financial architecture? Will they bring climate, nature, and development finance together in a more coherent way? Fourth, just in the past week, the US has frozen almost all foreign assistance, including all climate finance. While there will be a review over the next 90 days, we'll be watching to see how much of this finance is ultimately cut. A US retreat on development finance would have serious consequences. For the US, it could damage key geopolitical relationships, leave the country behind in important markets, and risk knock-on impacts on security and migration. For the world, this has widespread ramification for people who rely on life-saving assistance from the US. It is still too early to tell what US cuts will mean for reaching the $300 billion and $1.3 trillion goals by 2035, but they may impact the pace of the scale-up. We must explore multiple avenues to ensure climate finance reaches $1.3 trillion by 2035. This means recognizing that climate finance is not a niche concern, but an integral part of the broader international development context and goals. In the best case scenario, public finance will only get us almost halfway to $1.3 trillion. So how do we get the remaining $700 billion? Experts suggest this will need to be filled with international private capital, which brings us to our next story. This story is about making private capital flow. Attracting international private capital for climate investment has been extremely difficult for developing countries. Investors believe that projects in these countries would be high-risk investments. It is still much more expensive to borrow money to invest in clean energy in most developing countries than it is in Europe or in the United States. For example, the same project in Germany will require 8% in equity returns compared to in Zambia, which will require 51% in returns. The World Bank and other development finance institutions have instruments that absorb some of the initial risks from projects by providing guarantees. But there's not enough public resources to de-risk $700 billion of private capital needed per year by 2035. Among developing countries, India is a critical outlier, having attracted significant private capital for clean energy investments in recent years. To help us understand what's going on there, let's go to Bengaluru and meet Pavan Mulukutla from WRI India.
Every country faces challenge in attracting climate finance. Here in India, we know public finance isn't enough to meet the climate finance needs of $100 billion each year. We also need private capital. And there has been a lot of hard work to create a more welcoming environment for private capital that is now paying dividend, meaning more money for new facilities such as the solar array of Kempegowda International Airport here in Bengaluru. First of all, the government is setting ambitious targets indicating to the private sector they are serious about making the switch and that India is a market worth investing in. They have set out clear goals and sectoral targets. India's National Electricity Plan aims at achieving 500 gigawatt of clean energy by 2030 and 600 by 2032. There is also a target for states to reach 43% share of renewable electricity by 2030. But they haven't just set goals. They also have a strategic roadmap for how they will support the shift towards clean energy through a series of nudges from India's policy makers. This provides investors with the predictable incentives that give them the confidence they need. The government has also signaled support for greening the economy through budgetary allocations and subsidies in both existing and new areas. This is also aimed at building investor confidence and building momentum alongside the national government's ratcheting up of ambition. When it works, it's not the government that has to put in the money. Instead, it makes it easier and more profitable for private capital to invest in India's transition. Third, government at both national and state level has made it clear that the transition to clean energy is all about competitive advantage, about building strong and prosperous economies for the future. Here in India, we are seeing progress in how a country can attract more private climate finance, but it needs to build upon its successes to bring the money needed. But the example of India shows us what can be done to make the engine of private climate finance work so much more effective, and that's a key part of our story to watch for 2025.
That was Pawan Mulukutla, WR India's Executive Director for Integrated Transportation, Clean Air, Hydrogen. Of course, India has advantages, including its growing economy, its deep pools of domestic private capital, and the size of its internal market. But there are few things that India did that all developing countries need to do to attract international private finance. As Pawan noted, India started by setting clear sectoral targets, which should be connected to each country's NDCs. Then, India put in place supportive national and state-level policies to nudge private sector. In addition, the government and the domestic banks introduced new instruments to enable sustainable financing to flow more freely and more efficiently. Critically, the government of India has significantly ramped up its investment of public capital in the sector. Between 2004 and 2014, the government spent less than $700 million. However, in 2024 alone, the government budget for the sector increased to $2.4 billion, growing the confidence of private investors. Most importantly, we see how some of the missing private finance in the $1.3 trillion needed can be mobilized by policies and targeted use of public capital. Public-private partnership will be the key to de-risk and attract sufficient private capital. We have seen effective examples of this holistic approach from China's Green Industrial Policy and the United States Inflation Reduction Act. While few countries will have this kind of firepower at their disposal, the lesson about setting clear ambition and backing it with strong public policy and public finance is relevant everywhere. For example, in 2019, the African Development Bank loaned funds to Morocco to support coordinated domestic climate policies. By 2021, this funding offered guarantees to nearly 50,000 medium and small enterprises, supported 1,100 projects led by women, and helped realize approximately $300 million in private equity investment. So, what should we watch for this year? First, keep an eye out for country platforms. These are country-driven initiatives to bring different pieces of public and private capital together behind priority investment. For example, Colombia just launched its country platform. We'll be watching how many new ones are launched, how the existing platforms get underway, and whether they enable countries to rapidly scale up private investment in climate action. Second, following the recent US election, 6 banks pulled out of the Net Zero Banking Alliance. Will backlash against ESG initiatives slow climate investments? Or will net zero transition plans and increasing risk disclosures in Europe, Japan, and other countries continue to drive green investments? Third, credit rating agencies have been criticized for overestimating the risk of investment in developing countries. Will leaders at the Finance for Development Conference agree to evaluate this risk differently? Fourth, the annual Finance in Common Summit in Cape Town will bring together 500 public development banks, representing $23 trillion in assets. As we saw in India, public development banks can act as a critical bridge for climate-related investment within countries. Will all banks embrace this as a central mission? With international private capital expected to fill half of the $1.3 trillion in climate finance needs by 2035, countries must work together to drastically scale up international flows. Our fourth story is about innovation. We can't predict exactly how much of the $1.3 trillion in financing will be generated through innovation, but we do know that we won't succeed without it. We need innovation in financial instruments across public and private capital. Financing nature is a very good example where vast financial innovation is needed. There is overwhelming evidence that biodiversity is very connected to climate outcomes. Nature is critical for mitigating climate change, sustaining biodiversity, cleaning our air and water, and helping us adapt to climate impacts. Some estimate 55% of global GDP depends on nature. For example, food, medical advances, and clean water all depend on high-functioning biodiversity. However, it has been very difficult to finance the protection of nature, and we're losing it quickly. According to the Global Forest Watch, tropical primary forest loss in 2023 was 3.7 million hectares, equivalent to losing 10 football fields per minute. The current economic incentive is to chop down forest and overfish the ocean. It is incredibly difficult to finance nature because we have failed to put an economic value on all the services ecosystems provide. Brazil has come up with one innovative initiative to scale up nature finance. Let's go to Sao Paulo, where Mirella Sandrini can tell us more.
How do you put a price on nature? The whole world needs to protect its forests, the oceans, and its habitats. But how do you make nature finance work? Here in Brazil, we know our tropical forests bring global benefits like absorbing carbon, preserving biodiversity, and regulating rain patterns. But they are also a local economic resources, and there is money to be made from extractive uses like logging, mining, or farming cleared land. The question is, how can the world pay so the forests here are protected, not exploited? One innovative idea here in Brazil might have found a way to meet the challenge: the Tropical Forest Forever Facility, or TFFF, aims at paying out the predictable annual figure of around $4 for every hectare of a preserved tropical forest, year after year. The idea, initiated by the Brazilian government and the World Bank, is that rich countries and philanthropies initially invested $25 billion. This then brings in a further $100 billion from private investors, making the biggest single pot of money aimed at fighting climate change and biodiversity loss. Once invested, this money would provide the returns for those predictable payments for intact tropical forest. There would also be a penalty of $400 for any hectare that is lost, all verified by satellite. The key things with the TFFF is that none of the money from rich countries, philanthropies, or private investors is donation. It would be returned after 20 years with interest slightly higher than government bonds. That makes this a new and innovative way to raise finance for nature. And it would make a real difference to protecting our forest. There is still a lot to do to get the TFFF up and running. This is a vital year to see if the financing, the monitoring, and the governance can be sorted out in the run-up to the Belem COP30. And that's why this is part of WRI Stories to Watch for 2025.
That was Mirella Sandrini, who leads WRI Brazil. So there's a long way to go with TFFF. But if it does work, then it could change the way we're able to provide finance for forest. The key word is ambition, being able to mobilize enough money to make a difference and protect nature at the level we need. There won't be a silver bullet that solves nature finance. We need further innovations, better policies, standards, and regulations, as well as high-quality carbon and biodiversity markets. There's a place for innovations such as natural capital asset companies, land banks, as well as more traditional blended finance. So, what should we watch for this year? First, as Mirella said, there is a lot to make TFFF work. In 2025, we'll be watching for progress. Will the Brazilian government be able to assemble the finance to get it started? And will this draw in private capital? In addition, last October, world leaders met in Cali, Colombia, for the COP16 Biodiversity Conference to find ways to save and restore nature. But they walked away without a financial deal. Will leaders strike an ambitious nature finance deal when COP16 talks resume in Rome in February? In particular, we're watching to see how they bring together biodiversity and climate finance. Carbon markets have existed for some time, but they have yet to meet their full potential. When the voluntary carbon market was at all-time high of about $2 billion per year in 2021, many thought it would grow at least $10 billion by 2030. But the markets have fallen significantly, and such growth now seems unlikely. High integrity, high value carbon markets can still play an important role in financing nature. Will new integrity standards and increasing signals from government boost investor confidence in carbon markets? Will debt for nature swaps become a growing trend? Barbados recently used guarantees from MDBs to reduce its debt payments in return for conservation investments. Ecuador is using one of these to help conserve Galapagos National Park, committing to spend $18 million annually over 20 years. Will we see a more systemic approach to debt restructuring and relief to support nature and climate investment at scale? Finally, will there be reforms of subsidy regimes? More than $635 billion is spent on agricultural subsidy annually, placing immense pressure on natural ecosystems worldwide. As COP16's discussion resumes, countries are calling for the redirection of at least $500 billion in subsidies harmful to biodiversity. Denmark approved a new policy in 2024 aiming to better balance agriculture and nature. And the UK is starting to reconfigure agricultural subsidy to pay farmers for ecosystem services. Will other countries follow? It's not only imperative that climate and nature finance work together, but it's an opportunity to innovate our approach and find new pathways of financing nature. I hope you have enjoyed this journey through the intricacies of finance. The $1.3 trillion is possible to reach, but many things need to happen to make it flow by 2035. Some of it is already in play, including the $300 billion agreed at the last COP. Some of it is still in the idea stage, such as the maritime taxes and TFFF. Additional innovation also need to be developed. The biggest challenge will be mobilizing $700 billion in private capital. While developing countries can try to de-risk this capital with better policies and co-investments, richer countries also have to provide incentives to ensure private capital flows to these countries. This year will be an important year to start moving towards this goal. The $1.3 trillion will be catalytic for developing countries, equipping them with resources to finish the job themselves. Each part of the $1.3 trillion is connected. Like a pieces of a puzzle, one element of the $1.3 trillion can leverage and mobilize another piece. However, today, the different elements are governed by different regimes. That's why the biggest thing to watch in 2025 is how we'll bring all these pieces together. For maximum leverage and efficiency, we need to draw on all sources of finance and make it work together as a system. And that requires the deep involvement of finance ministers and even heads of state from countries across the world. There are many things to watch over the next year. November will be a key month. At COP30 in Brazil, we need a deal that shows that the 1.3 trillion can be mobilized. And right on the heels of the COP, the G20 will meet. They're the world's biggest economies, countries that make up over 85% of global GDP and 75% of global emissions. The G20 is the only body that has the capacity and authority to connect the various pieces around finance. This year, will the G20 in South Africa make climate finance a long-term priority? And will the G20 help the world bring these pieces together as a system? So as we step into 2025, there is a growing recognition that our financial system must be reimagined to tackle climate change, protect nature, and improve people's lives. This transformation won't be easy, but you can see from today's presentation that there are many tools to get us there. By demanding bold steps from our leaders, leveraging limited resources to maximum impact, and harnessing innovation, we have the power to unlock financial flows to some of the world's most pressing challenges. Will we see the beginning of this transformation this year? Thank you for joining us for Stories to Watch 2025.